Garrett Steele never expected that buying a quiet home in the suburbs would turn into the worst decision of his life. At 42, he had finally reached a place where he could afford solitude, away from the noise of the city and the exhausting demands of his engineering job. He wasn't the type who needed constant socializing, nor did he have the patience for nosy neighbors. His newly purchased home was exactly what he had been looking for: a well-maintained property with a spacious backyard, a high wooden fence providing privacy, and most importantly, the hot tub on the back deck where he could unwind after long days at work. He wasn't a man of many indulgences, but this was the one luxury he had allowed himself, a small oasis of calm in an otherwise pragmatic life. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. The neighbors kept to themselves, and he enjoyed the silence that his new home provided. The hot tub became a nightly ritual, a place where he could sit with a drink in hand, stare up at the sky, and let the hum of the warm water drown out the weight of reality. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly made up of older residents, retirees, and families that seemed to have lived there for years. It was the kind of place where people took pride in their properties, where lawns were always neatly trimmed, and where an unspoken rule of mutual respect seemed to be followed. That was, until he met Karen Aldrich. Karen, a woman in her mid-50s, lived 2 houses down, though she had a habit of acting as if she owned the entire street. The first time Garrett saw her, she was standing in her front yard, hands on her hips, watching him with an expression that was difficult to read. Not exactly friendly, not openly hostile, but something in the way her eyes lingered on him made him feel as though he was already under scrutiny. He gave a polite nod as he walked past, but she made no effort to respond. It was a small thing, but something about her made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Their first real interaction came a few days later. Garrett had just finished some minor repairs in the backyard when he heard someone calling out to him from the other side of the fence. He turned to see Karen peeking over, a wide smile stretched across her face, though her eyes held something else, something calculating. "So you're the new neighbor," she said, her voice overly sweet, almost rehearsed. "I was wondering when you were going to introduce yourself." Garrett wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and offered a short, polite response. "Yeah, I just moved in a couple of weeks ago. Still getting settled." Karen nodded but didn't move away. You know, the last people who lived here never really fit in. Didn't really understand what it meant to be part of a community. She let the words hang in the air, as if waiting for a reaction, but Garrett wasn't sure what she expected him to say. "I keep to myself mostly," he admitted, hoping she'd take the hint. Karen's smile didn't falter. "Oh, I've noticed. You don't have many visitors." Something about the way she said it made Garrett feel uneasy. There was an implication beneath her words, as if she had been watching him, keeping track of his habits. He forced a small chuckle. "I work a lot. Haven't had much time for anything else." Karen tilted her head slightly, then glanced toward the backyard, her gaze settling on the hot tub. "That's a nice little setup you've got there. I've always wanted one of those, but my late husband never saw the point." Garrett didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't about to invite her over for a soak, so he simply muttered, "Yeah, it's great after a long day." Karen hummed in response but didn't immediately leave. She lingered just long enough to make the interaction uncomfortable before finally saying, "Well, it's good to have new blood in the neighborhood. Maybe we'll see more of each other." It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but something about the way she said it left Garrett feeling unsettled. He chalked it up to his own social awkwardness, but deep down, something about her just felt off. A few days later, strange things started happening. It was nothing overt at first, just little things that could have been coincidence but felt wrong. The first time, he noticed the backyard gate was slightly ajar in the morning, even though he always made sure to lock it. Then there was the matter of his trash bins. One morning, he found them knocked over, garbage spilling onto his driveway. He assumed it was an animal, but the placement was odd, as if they had been deliberately kicked. Then, one evening after work, he stepped outside onto his deck and noticed something that made his stomach turn. The cover of the hot tub was slightly shifted, and there were wet footprints on the wooden planks leading away from it. They were faint, as if whoever had been there had already mostly dried off, but they were undeniably human. His immediate thought was that it must have been a mistake. Maybe a maintenance worker had checked something, even though he hadn't scheduled any repairs. But as he lifted the cover and dipped his fingers into the water, he felt the warmth that told him it had been used recently. Someone had been in his hot tub. His mind immediately went to Karen. The way she had looked at it, the way she had lingered on his property as if it belonged to her. But it seemed ridiculous who would actually sneak into someone else's yard just to use a hot tub. It didn't make sense. Still, the thought unsettled him enough that he started locking the gate with an extra deadbolt. He wasn't paranoid by nature, but this wasn't something he could ignore. The following night, the pattern repeated itself. This time, he checked the water level before going to bed, making sure it was exactly where it should be. When he went outside the next morning, the level had changed. Someone had used it again. It was deliberate. Whoever was doing this wasn't just passing through, they knew what they were doing, and they weren't afraid of being caught. This wasn't just a minor annoyance anymore. It was an invasion. Garrett knew he had to put a stop to it. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Garrett could no longer pretend that what was happening was a coincidence. Someone had been using his hot tub, and it wasn't an accident, nor was it a simple case of a trespasser wandering onto his property. Whoever it was had returned more than once, and that meant they either believed they had a right to be there or they simply didn't care about the consequences of being caught. He double-checked the locks on his gates, securing them as best as he could, but it didn't put him at ease. The thought of someone sneaking onto his deck in the middle of the night, making themselves comfortable in a space that was supposed to be his private sanctuary, filled him with an uneasy tension that wouldn't go away. That night, he made the decision to stay up late and keep watch from the shadows of his living room. He turned off all the lights, positioned himself near the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, and waited. The minutes stretched into hours, and for a while it seemed like nothing would happen. The quiet hum of the night settled around him, and he started to wonder if maybe he was being paranoid. But then, just past midnight, he heard it, the faint creak of the gate. His body tensed immediately, his pulse quickening as he peered through the glass. The motion-activated backyard light flickered on, casting a soft glow over the deck, and for a moment he saw nothing. But then, just as his eyes adjusted, he spotted a figure slipping into the hot tub, as if they belonged there. Karen. Garrett felt a strange mix of anger and disbelief wash over him. He had suspected it was her, but actually seeing her sitting there, completely at ease in his hot tub, sent a surge of frustration through him. She leaned back against the edge, eyes half closed, as if she had done this 100 times before. A towel was draped over one of his patio chairs, and beside it sat a half-empty bottle of wine that she had apparently brought with her. She had planned this. She hadn't just snuck in on impulse, she had come prepared, expecting to settle in for a long, comfortable soak in something that wasn't hers. Garrett pushed open the sliding door, stepping outside with slow, deliberate movements. Karen didn't react at first, as if she either didn't notice or didn't care that she had been caught. Only when he cleared his throat did she open her eyes, looking up at him with an expression of mild annoyance, as if he was the one intruding on her. "Oh," she said, tilting her head slightly. "You're still awake." Garrett crossed his arms over his chest, his voice low and controlled. "What the hell are you doing?" Karen let out a small sigh, barely acknowledging the question as she lazily trailed her fingers through the water. Relaxing. "It's a beautiful night." "That's not what I meant," he snapped. "You're on my property, using my hot tub, without my permission. Do you have any idea how insane that is?" She raised an eyebrow, her expression remaining infuriatingly calm. "Oh, Garrett. There's no need to be so dramatic. It's just a hot tub." "It's not just a hot tub, Karen. It's mine. And you don't have any right to be here." Karen let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head as if she found the whole situation amusing. You know, my late husband always said that good neighbors should share with each other. This street used to be so much more welcoming before people started acting so territorial. Garrett felt his patience wearing dangerously thin. I'm not going to ask you again. Get out. She sighed again, as if indulging a child's tantrum, and slowly sat up, the water sloshing around her as she made no effort to rush. Fine, fine, no need to be rude about it. She reached for the towel on the chair, wrapping it around herself with deliberate slowness before picking up her bottle of wine. As she walked past him, she paused, looking him in the eye with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was no embarrassment, no shame, only something that almost resembled amusement. You really should learn to be more neighborly, Garrett, she said, her voice carrying an edge of something almost condescending. People around here don't like unfriendly newcomers. She walked off toward the gate, slipping out as if she hadn't just been caught trespassing, and Garrett stood frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't some misunderstanding. This wasn't an innocent mistake. She had deliberately walked onto his property, used something that belonged to him, and then acted as if he was the one being unreasonable. And the worst part? She didn't seem the least bit concerned about the consequences. Garrett barely slept that night, his mind racing with frustration and unease. The way she had spoken to him, the way she had carried herself, it all felt wrong. She hadn't acted like someone who had been caught doing something inappropriate. She had acted like someone who believed she had every right to be there. And if she believed that, then there was no guarantee that she wouldn't do it again. The next morning, he took extra precautions. He replaced the locks on the gates with stronger ones, made sure the sliding doors were fully secured, and even installed a motion sensor alarm that would trigger if someone stepped onto the deck without permission. He was done playing games. If Karen tried this again, she would know exactly how serious he was. For a couple of days, things were quiet. He didn't see Karen, and there were no more signs of intrusion. He started to believe that maybe she had gotten the message, that maybe she had finally backed off. But then, late one evening, as he stepped outside to check on things, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. A wine glass half full, sitting on the patio table. He hadn't put it there. His pulse quickened as he scanned the yard, his eyes darting to the hot tub, to the locked gate, to the fence. Everything else seemed normal. The water level hadn't changed. The gate was still shut. But that glass, it was proof that someone had been there, that someone had walked onto his deck, sat down at his table, and left their drink behind as if they had every right to be there. He didn't touch it. Instead, he went back inside, grabbed his phone, and called the police. When the officers arrived, he explained everything: the unauthorized entry, the repeated trespassing, the clear violation of his privacy. He led them to the backyard, pointed to the glass on the table, explained that he hadn't placed it there. One of the officers, a man in his mid-50s with a tired expression, let out a small sigh. You said this neighbor of yours has been doing this more than once. Yes, Garrett said firmly, and she's going to keep doing it if someone doesn't stop her. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before turning back to him. We can file a report, but unless she's here when we arrive or there's clear evidence of forced entry, there's not much we can do. If she claims she was never here, it becomes a he said, she said situation. Garrett gritted his teeth. He should have expected that answer, but hearing it out loud made his frustration boil over. So what am I supposed to do? Just let her keep coming onto my property whenever she wants. The officer sighed again, shaking his head. Your best bet is to get a restraining order. But that could take some time. As the officers left, Garrett stood in his backyard, staring at that glass of wine sitting there like a mocking reminder that Karen wasn't done. She wasn't going to stop. And worst of all, she knew she could get away with it. Garrett had never considered himself a paranoid man. He was rational, methodical, and preferred to solve problems with logic rather than emotion. But as he stood in his backyard, staring at the half-full wine glass that had been left on his patio table like some kind of taunt, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about someone trespassing on his property anymore. This was about control, about someone deliberately testing his limits, pushing him just far enough to see how he would react. The fact that Karen had come back after he had explicitly told her to stay away wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a declaration. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. He needed to be smart about this. The police had already made it clear that, unless he had undeniable proof, they weren't going to do much. A report, a warning, maybe a conversation with her if she admitted to it, but beyond that, he was on his own. The suggestion of a restraining order lingered in his mind, but even that required more concrete evidence. He needed something indisputable, something that left no room for manipulation or lies. The next morning, he ordered a high-resolution security system with motion detection and night vision, something that would capture everything in clear detail. He spent the afternoon installing cameras around his property, positioning them strategically so that every entrance, every angle of the deck, and every vulnerable point was covered. If she came back, he would have undeniable proof. For a few nights, nothing happened. The footage was uneventful, just the occasional raccoon wandering across the deck, the wind rustling through the trees, the gentle movement of the water in the hot tub. He checked the recordings obsessively, each morning expecting to find something, but there was nothing. Part of him wondered if maybe Karen had finally gotten the message, if she had moved on to harassing someone else. Maybe the presence of police at his house had rattled her more than she let on. Then, on the fourth night, the alarm from the motion sensors went off at exactly 2:37 a.m. Garrett, already a light sleeper since all of this had started, was awake instantly. He didn't turn on the lights. He moved quietly, grabbing his phone as he checked the live feed from the cameras. There she was. Karen was standing on his deck, wrapped in a robe, looking completely unbothered by the fact that she was on someone else's property in the middle of the night. She wasn't trying to be discreet. She wasn't sneaking around or showing any signs of concern that she might get caught. She walked up to the hot tub and ran her fingers through the water before glancing toward the house, as if debating whether or not to get in. Then she turned and walked to the patio table, setting down what looked like another wine glass. Garrett clenched his jaw, his pulse hammering in his ears. He knew she was pushing him, testing how far she could go before he snapped. She wanted to see what he would do, wanted to gauge his reaction. If he called the police again, she would probably play dumb, act like she was confused, or claim she thought she had been invited. If he confronted her, she would likely twist the situation, turning it against him, painting him as some aggressive man intimidating an innocent woman. He had seen her type before, people who thrived on control, on knowing they could bend reality to suit their needs. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to play her game. He was going to take away her control. The next morning, he went straight to his lawyer's office. If the police weren't going to do anything, then he needed to take legal action himself. He provided the footage, the timestamps, the repeated incidents, and by the end of the meeting, they had begun filing for a restraining order. It wasn't an immediate solution, but it was something. It was proof that he wasn't just making accusations without evidence. But Karen wasn't done. That same evening, as Garrett pulled into his driveway after work, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. His backyard gate was wide open. He knew for a fact that he had locked it before leaving that morning. He parked the car, stepping out cautiously, his eyes scanning the property for any signs of movement. The sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the yard, and the air felt thick with something unspoken, something wrong. He moved toward the backyard, his footsteps silent against the pavement. When he reached the deck, he stopped cold. His hot tub was running. The cover had been removed, steam rising from the water, and Karen was sitting inside, completely at ease as if she belonged there. She had a drink in her hand, her head tilted back slightly as she let the warm water envelop her. She didn't flinch when he approached. She didn't look surprised or guilty. Instead, she looked mildly amused. "You really should keep this thing covered when you're not using it," she said casually, swirling the wine in her glass. "It keeps the heat from escaping." Garrett exhaled sharply, his patience at its breaking point. "Get out." Karen sighed, setting her glass down on the edge of the tub before standing up. She made no effort to cover herself, stepping out of the water with slow, deliberate movements. Water dripped from her skin onto the deck as she reached for her towel. "You know," she said, wrapping it around herself, "I thought we were starting to get along." Garrett didn't take the bait. He didn't let his expression change, didn't let her see how deeply she was getting under his skin. "If you ever set foot on my property again, I will have you arrested." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Oh, sweetheart, you've already tried that." She walked past him, the scent of her perfume cloying in the cool evening air. As she reached the gate, she glanced over her shoulder. "I hope you know this isn't over." Garrett didn't respond. He waited until she was gone, then turned back toward the hot tub, his hands clenched into fists. This had gone far beyond trespassing. This was deliberate psychological warfare. She wasn't just testing boundaries, she was asserting dominance, making it clear that she didn't see him as someone who could stop her. But she was wrong. That night he reinforced the locks, not just on the gate but on every possible entrance she could use. He installed additional security measures, ones she wouldn't see, ones that would alert him the second she set foot on his property again. He wasn't going to sit back and let her dictate the terms of this situation anymore. 2 nights later, the alarms went off again. But this time, when Garrett checked the cameras, Karen wasn't alone. She had brought someone with her. A man taller than her, dressed in dark clothing, stood beside her at the gate. They spoke for a moment, too quietly for the microphones to pick up, and then the man reached into his pocket, pulling out what looked like a set of tools. Garrett's stomach dropped. They were trying to break in. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was escalation. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "I have 2 people attempting to break into my property. I have them on video. Send someone now." The dispatcher asked for details, but Garrett barely heard her. His eyes were locked onto the screen, watching as the man fiddled with the lock, Karen standing beside him with that same infuriating smirk. The second they realized they were being watched, it would already be too late. The police were on their way, and this time there would be no excuses. Garrett had never been the kind of man who relied on the authorities to solve his problems. He was used to handling things himself, using logic and patience to get through any situation. But as he watched the live feed of Karen and the unknown man trying to break into his property, something inside him told him that logic wasn't going to be enough anymore. This wasn't just about trespassing, about some unstable neighbor who didn't understand boundaries. This was something else entirely. This was deliberate, methodical, and if he didn't take action now, he knew things would only escalate further. The police dispatcher kept talking, asking for details, but Garrett could barely focus on her words. His eyes were locked on the screen as the man continued to work at the lock, the metallic glint of his tools catching the dim glow of the streetlight. Karen stood beside him, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of amusement and anticipation. She wasn't just watching, she was enjoying this. She wanted him to see, wanted him to know that she wasn't afraid of getting caught, that she didn't believe for a second that there would be consequences. "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said, her voice professional, detached. "Officers are en route to your location." Garrett clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the phone. He wanted to go outside to stop them himself, but he knew that was exactly what Karen wanted. She wanted him to react, to give her another opportunity to play the victim. No, he wasn't going to make it that easy for her. He was going to wait. He was going to let the police catch her in the act. Minutes passed like hours. The man at the gate worked quickly, efficiently, and Garrett had the sickening realization that this wasn't some random friend Karen had dragged into her schemes. This man knew what he was doing. This wasn't his first time picking the lock. Garrett forced himself to take slow, steady breaths, his mind racing with questions. Who was he? How did Karen know him? Was he just another pawn in whatever twisted game she was playing, or was this something more? Then suddenly the blue and red glow of police lights washed over the yard, the distant wail of sirens cutting through the stillness of the night. The man at the gate froze for half a second before quickly shoving his tools back into his pocket. Karen turned toward the flashing lights, her face twisting into something Garrett couldn't quite decipher: annoyance, calculation, something else lurking beneath the surface. The police car came to a stop at the curb, and within seconds, two officers stepped out, one of them already reaching for his flashlight. Garrett moved toward the front door, keeping his phone in hand as he watched the scene unfold through the peephole. "Step away from the gate," one of the officers ordered, his voice firm, authoritative. The man lifted his hand slightly, taking a single step back, his expression carefully blank. Karen, on the other hand, immediately put on her best performance, her voice rising in practiced distress. "Oh, thank God you're here. This is such a misunderstanding." Garrett felt his teeth grind together. The officers exchanged a brief glance before the taller one spoke again. "We received a report about an attempted break-in at this address. Do you want to tell me what you two are doing here?" Karen placed a hand over her chest, her eyes widening in an expression of pure innocence. "Officer, this is just ridiculous. I live right down the street. Garrett and I are neighbors. We had an agreement that I could use his backyard whenever I wanted, but I guess he changed his mind without telling me." Garrett's stomach twisted. She was good at this, too good. Her tone, her body language, everything was crafted to make her look like the reasonable one, like she was the victim of some cruel misunderstanding. The officer glanced toward the man beside her. "And you?" The man shrugged. "I was just helping her out. She said she lost the key." The officer's jaw tightened slightly. "So you thought the best course of action was to pick the lock?" Karen let out a dramatic sigh. "I didn't realize he was going to do that. I just needed to grab something I left in Garrett's backyard. I didn't think it would be such a big deal." Garrett had heard enough. He pulled open the door and stepped outside, his pulse steady but his anger barely restrained beneath the surface. "She's lying," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We had no agreement. I've told her multiple times to stay off my property, and I have security footage of her trespassing, including tonight." Karen's expression didn't falter. Instead, she turned toward him with a look of feigned hurt. "Garrett, I don't understand why you're doing this. I thought we were friends." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Friends don't break into each other's property. One of the officers turned toward him. "You have footage of tonight's incident?" "Yes," Garrett nodded. "I can show you everything." Karen's face barely flickered, but for the first time, there was something almost resembling unease in her eyes. The officer gestured toward her and the man. "We're going to need you both to come with us for questioning." Karen let out a small, breathy laugh, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Oh, come on, this is ridiculous." The officer didn't waver. "You can explain everything at the station." The man beside her gave a slow nod, his gaze unreadable, but Karen hesitated. Just for a moment. Just long enough for Garrett to see the flicker of something dangerous in her eyes before she finally sighed and held out her hands. "Fine. Let's just get this over with." As the officers led them toward the patrol car, Karen turned her head just enough to look back at Garrett, and when she did, she smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a nervous one, but something else entirely. A promise. A warning. This isn't over. Garrett stood on his porch long after the police car disappeared down the street, the night settling around him in thick, suffocating silence. He should have felt relieved. He should have felt like he had won, that the worst of it was over. But he didn't, because he knew Karen. He knew her type, and people like her didn't just give up. No, this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Garrett had hoped that the arrest would be the end of it, that once Karen had been taken in for questioning, once she realized she could no longer manipulate the situation to her advantage, she would finally back off. But even as he stood on his porch that night, watching the taillights of the police car disappear down the street, a heavy weight settled in his chest. The look Karen had given him before she was driven away wasn't one of fear or regret. It wasn't the look of someone who had realized they had gone too far. It was something else entirely, something far worse. It was the look of someone who saw this as a challenge, as a game she had no intention of losing. He barely slept that night. Even with the knowledge that she was in police custody, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease, couldn't stop himself from checking the locks, the security cameras, the backyard. His body remained tense, his mind replaying every interaction, every warning sign he had ignored. Karen had been escalating from the beginning, pushing boundaries, seeing how much she could get away with, and now that she had been caught, now that the police were involved, he knew that whatever happened next would be worse. The next morning he received a call from the police station. Karen had been released. No charges had been filed. The officer on the line sounded apologetic, but his words only made Garrett's anger burn hotter. She claimed she didn't know what the guy was doing, said she never told him to pick the lock. We don't have enough to hold her. Garrett forced himself to stay calm. What about the video footage? She was on my property. She knew exactly what was happening. The officer hesitated. We're filing a report, but unless you want to push for a restraining order, legally, she hasn't done enough for us to arrest her. Garrett clenched his jaw. He had already started the process of filing for a restraining order, but he knew that would take time, and even if he got one, it wouldn't physically stop her from doing whatever she wanted. Karen wasn't afraid of the law. She wasn't afraid of consequences. And she had just proven it. The silence on the other end of the line stretched, and when the officer finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more personal. Look, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but be careful. If she's as obsessive as you say, she might try something worse. Garrett ended the call and set the phone down with a quiet thud. Worse. That word echoed in his mind, an ugly premonition of what was coming. By the time he left for work, he had almost convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, Karen would stay away for a while, that she would take a break after being taken in for questioning. But when he pulled into his driveway that evening, his stomach twisted at the sight in front of him. His front door was open. The lock was broken, the wood around the frame splintered where it had been forced open. Every muscle in his body went rigid as he stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the property, his mind immediately calculating the possibilities. Was she still inside? Was she alone? Did she bring someone else with her? His hand instinctively went to his phone as he moved cautiously toward the entrance, forcing his breathing to remain steady. He wasn't reckless, he knew better than to charge in without knowing what he was walking into. Instead, he took a step back, staying in the open, and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered almost immediately. My house has been broken into, Garrett said, his voice calm but firm. The door's been forced open. I don't know if the intruder is still inside. Stay outside, the dispatcher instructed. Officers are on their way. Do not enter the house. Garrett had no intention of going inside until the police arrived, but his fists clenched as he stared at the open doorway, rage simmering beneath his skin. He already knew who had done this. He knew before he even stepped onto the porch, before he heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. He didn't need to see her inside to know that Karen had finally crossed the line she had been inching toward from the moment they met. The officers arrived within minutes, moving in quickly with weapons drawn, clearing the house room by room while Garrett waited outside, his jaw locked so tightly that it ached. When they finally emerged, one of them nodded at him, motioning him forward. She's not here, the officer said, but you should take a look at this. Garrett stepped inside, his entire body thrumming with adrenaline as his eyes moved over the damage. The house itself hadn't been ransacked, nothing was stolen, nothing destroyed. Instead, everything was just slightly off. Personal items had been moved. Papers from his desk had been sifted through. A chair in the living room had been turned at an angle that he never would have left it in. The air felt tainted, invaded, as if someone had been walking through his space, touching his things, studying his life. Then he saw the message. Scrawled in red lipstick across his bathroom mirror were 3 words that sent a chill down his spine. "You owe me." His hands curled into fists. "Do you have security footage?" one of the officers asked. Garrett forced himself to breathe before answering. "Yes. In." They pulled up the footage together, and sure enough, there she was. Karen, bold as ever, walking up to his front door in broad daylight, looking over her shoulder once before pulling something from her pocket, what looked like a set of lockpicks. Within seconds, she was inside. She had spent nearly an hour there, wandering from room to room, touching his things, going through his desk. Then, just before leaving, she had stopped in the bathroom, rummaged through his drawers, and used his own lipstick to leave her message. The officers exchanged looks. "This changes things," one of them muttered. "Breaking and entering, property damage, this is more than trespassing now." Garrett exhaled slowly. "So you'll arrest her?" The officer hesitated. "We'll bring her in, but be prepared she might make bail fast." Garrett didn't care. Let her make bail. Let her think she had won again. Because this time, he wasn't just waiting for her to make her next move. He was going to be ready. By the time Karen was arrested that evening, Garrett had already reinforced every lock, installed additional security, and sent copies of the footage directly to his lawyer. He wasn't leaving any room for manipulation, for loopholes, for excuses. And when she got out and he knew he would be ready for whatever came next. Because Karen wasn't just trying to take his space anymore. She was trying to take control. And Garrett Steele wasn't about to let that happen. Garrett had thought that Karen breaking into his home and leaving that message on his mirror was the worst she could do, but he had underestimated her. He had underestimated just how deeply she was willing to dig her claws into his life, how far she would go to prove that she had control over the situation. The night after her arrest, he slept for the first time in what felt like weeks, convinced that she would remain in custody long enough for him to regain some sense of normalcy. He was wrong. By noon the next day, she was out on bail. He found out when his phone vibrated with a notification from his security system. He checked the feed immediately, his stomach twisting as he saw her standing just outside the property, just beyond the reach of the cameras, as if she knew exactly where the blind spots were. She didn't try to come inside this time. She just stood there, staring at his house, waiting. Garrett's blood ran cold. She knew she couldn't cross the line again, not yet, not while the police had a close eye on her. But she also knew how to get under his skin, how to remind him that she wasn't going away. This wasn't just about trespassing anymore. It was about psychological warfare. For the next several days, it was the same thing. He would leave for work, come back, and find some small sign that she had been there. A single footprint in the dirt near the back fence. A fresh cigarette butt on the sidewalk near his driveway, even though she didn't smoke. Once, he found an old scarf draped over his mailbox, something that didn't belong to him but smelled faintly of her perfume. She wasn't breaking in anymore, but she was letting him know that she could. His lawyer had already filed for the restraining order, but that process took time. He wasn't willing to wait. He upgraded his security system again, this time installing additional motion sensors in the blind spots. He reinforced his windows, changed the locks again, and made sure that every point of entry was covered. But it wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. Then, one night, the game changed. It was past midnight when he heard the sound of shattering glass. The noise jolted him upright, his heart hammering against his ribs as he grabbed his phone, his fingers instinctively switching to the security feed. What he saw sent a sharp spike of adrenaline through his veins. Karen was inside his house. The kitchen window was broken, shards of glass scattered across the floor. She stood in the dim light, her posture eerily relaxed, as if she had just come home after a long day instead of breaking into someone else's property. She wasn't alone this time. The man from before, the one who had tried to pick his lock, was standing beside her. They were speaking, but Garrett couldn't hear the words. His hands were steady as he reached for his phone and dialed 911. There was no hesitation in his voice when the dispatcher answered. "There's a break-in at my house. 2 intruders. One of them is a repeat offender. I have live security footage. Send units now." The dispatcher confirmed that officers were on the way, but Garrett wasn't taking any chances. He had no intention of waiting in his bedroom while Karen wandered through his house like she owned it. He moved silently, retrieving the legally registered firearm he kept locked in a biometric safe in his office. He wasn't a man who liked violence, but he also wasn't a man who was going to sit back and allow himself to be cornered in his own home. He could hear them moving through the house now, their footsteps deliberate, unhurried. She wasn't here to steal anything. She wasn't here to leave another message. She was here to make sure he knew that nothing he did could stop her. He positioned himself in the hallway, partially concealed by the shadows, his body tense but his hands steady. He could hear her voice now, low and smooth, carrying that same unsettling amusement she always had. "He thinks he can win," she murmured, as if this was just a game. The man beside her chuckled. "He's making it fun, at least." Garrett stepped forward, his voice cutting through the dark. "The police are on their way." Karen didn't flinch. She turned her head slightly, as if finally acknowledging him. "Oh, Garrett," she said, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Always so dramatic." His grip on the gun remained firm. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. "You broke into my house. You're not walking away from this one." The man beside her shifted slightly, and Garrett saw the glint of something metallic in his hand. A knife. His body reacted before his mind even finished processing it. He took a step back, widening the distance between them. He wasn't stupid enough to let himself get close. Karen sighed, as if this was all so exhausting for her. "You could have made this so much easier," she murmured. "But no, you had to go and fight back." Garrett's pulse was steady. "That's exactly what I'm doing." Then, in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens. For the first time, Karen's expression faltered. The man beside her muttered something under his breath, looking toward the broken window, calculating whether they could make a run for it. Garrett took another step forward. "Try it," he said, his voice even. "See what happens." The man hesitated, then swore under his breath before making a break for the back door. Karen stayed where she was, her eyes locked onto Garrett's, as if trying to decide her next move. The sirens were louder now, flashing lights appearing through the windows. She let out a small, sharp laugh. "You think this is over?" she whispered. Garrett didn't respond. The door burst open, police flooding the house, weapons drawn. Karen finally raised her hands in surrender, her smile never fading, even as they placed her in cuffs. Even as they dragged her away, she kept her eyes on him. Garrett exhaled slowly, his hands finally relaxing as the officers cleared the house. One of them approached him, taking his statement, asking if he was hurt. He wasn't. He was fine, he was better than fine. Because for the first time he saw something different in Karen's expression as they led her outside. Fear. For the first time, she wasn't in control. And that, more than anything, told him that he had won. Garrett watched from his porch as the police car carrying Karen disappeared down the street, the red and blue lights casting eerie flashes against the houses. The night air was heavy, filled with the scent of broken glass, disturbed dust, and something far more intangible, the lingering presence of someone who had made it their mission to invade his life. Even as the sound of sirens faded into the distance, his body remained tense, his mind struggling to accept that this was finally over. He had spent weeks living with the constant dread that she would return, that no matter how many times he told her to stay away, no matter how many locks he installed or reports he filed, she would always find a way back. But now, for the first time, it felt different. This wasn't another warning. This wasn't just another escalation. This was the end. The officers remained on the property, documenting everything, marking off areas with yellow tape, speaking in low tones as they assessed the damage. One of them approached him, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a sharp, tired gaze. He had been the same officer who had taken Garrett's reports the first time, the one who had told him to be careful, that people like Karen often didn't stop until they were forced to. "You all right?" the officer asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Garrett nodded, though the weight in his chest told him he was far from all right. "Yeah." The officer studied him for a long moment, then let out a breath. "She's not getting out this time," he said. Breaking and entering, destruction of property, and given the fact that she had an accomplice with a weapon, we're looking at additional charges for criminal conspiracy. That's not something a judge is going to take lightly. Garrett didn't respond right away. He let the words settle in, let himself believe them. "How long?" he finally asked. "She won't be out any time soon," the officer assured him. Her previous arrests were for trespassing and harassment, nothing violent. But this is different. And the fact that she was already on bail for the last incident? That's going to work against her in a big way. Garrett nodded again, this time feeling some of the tension in his body begin to unravel. The officer gave him a final look, then motioned toward the broken kitchen window. "We'll need to collect any additional footage you have. But after that, you should focus on securing the place again, just to be safe." "Yeah," Garrett murmured. "I will." By the time the last of the police left, it was nearly dawn. He stood in his living room, staring at the mess Karen had left behind. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't even done much damage. But that wasn't the point. She had walked through his home like it was hers, as if she was entitled to be there, as if she was making one final statement before everything fell apart for her. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to move, to act. He swept the broken glass, wiped away the smudges her fingers had left on the kitchen counter, put everything back where it belonged. It was an instinctive response, an effort to reclaim his space, to erase the traces of her intrusion. It was only after the house was quiet again, after the adrenaline had finally worn off, that he sat down at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. It was really over. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, insurance claims, court filings. His lawyer assured him that with the charges stacked against her, Karen wouldn't be seeing the outside world for a long time. He didn't attend the hearings he didn't need to. He had already lived through enough of it. But when his lawyer called to tell him that she had been sentenced to 5 years in prison with no possibility of early release, he felt something that had eluded him for weeks. Relief. For the first time in months, he didn't wake up expecting to see her shadow outside his window. He didn't check the security cameras every hour. The tension that had gripped his chest slowly began to unwind day by day until he almost felt normal again. He repaired the damage to his home, replaced the broken window, repainted the bathroom where she had left her message. Every change, every fix, felt like another step toward reclaiming what was his. The nightmares still came, sometimes flashes of her standing in his kitchen, her smirk, the way she had looked at him like she was playing a game only she understood, but they faded with time. The restraining order was still in place, though he doubted it would matter now. Even if she somehow found a way out earlier than expected, even if she still harbored some twisted obsession, she had lost. He had made sure of that. And then, one morning, he stepped out onto his deck, coffee in hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he looked at his hot tub and saw it for what it was supposed to be, not a battleground. Not a reminder of how she had invaded his life. Just a place to relax. He turned on the water, let the steam rise into the crisp morning air, and exhaled. She was gone. And she wasn't coming back.